Okay, thank you very much. And let me also thank Kevin and Linda and Andrew and Jeremy and the broader China Matters team for this invitation to speak tonight, and also to PwC for a wonderful venue. It's also a huge honour to be in conversation with Hamish McDonald, so yeah, it's a real pleasure. But most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming along. It's not easy to get out, and it's kind of a bit weird in these COVID times to sort of see people in 3 dimensions, so, you know, good on you. So anyway, Linda asked me to speak about the 3 questions, but she also then threw in, can you do gender and women as well? Now, as you've learned, I do a lot of work on gender, so I was more than happy to oblige. But that means you're in for a real blast of me telling you what I really think. So hold on to your seats. Yeah. So how do I see China? Well, like most people who've had a long relationship with any place or culture, my views have changed over time. Being prepared to change your views, grow and modify, sometimes just drastically, is really an important part of thinking individuals, in a successful culture. So I believe that it's actually really important to change your views, and it's also really important for businesses, community groups and organisations and nations to do that as well. Doesn't mean you're flaky or fickle, doesn't mean that you're wishy-washy or weak. It takes quite a bit of courage and energy to actually and humility to change your views and change your plans. And to me, China is a place that has demonstrated in the past and continues to demonstrate today precisely that capacity for self-critique, courageous change, and at no other time has that been more apparent than in the last decades since the 1850s through to today. So myriad people in that time have dedicated themselves to thinking about ways to improve their country. And it's not just the top-level stuff, it's not just superficial, it's actually really deep changes in the way that families are formed, the way that individuals interact with each other, how workplaces are organised. And some of the experiments have been disastrous, but all of the really good things have been achieved as well. And China's produced wealth, happiness, health for millions of people in the last several decades because somebody, and several people in fact, resolved to really take a look at their culture, at the structures that underlie it, at the habits, and then really make some serious changes. And I think that takes takes a lot of courage, hard work, and it takes really flexible brains. So my perspective on China today is that it's drawing on this rich well of a capacity for taking their country seriously and taking risks to reflect and improve in order to make a better China. They're not letting their country just drift along like we apparently appear to be happy to do. In today's China, in contrast to the 1910s, 1920s, when there was the greatest Chinese backyard blitz of all times, ideas are more centralised in origin. They're coming from the Central Party school. They're more carefully crafted, and they're crafted in the delivery, in authorised versions, with each word weighed and disseminated through authorised publicity organs. So the habit of researching and modifying and advocating for change is actually in the CPC's DNA, as it was in the imperial and republican eras of the 1880s and the 1920s. Now, amidst all of that willingness to change, there are half-truths, spins, lies, mistakes, some of which have had grave consequences. Careerism by one rising individual crushes a better idea from a less influential person. There's limited tolerance for public objections and disagreements once the plan's been rolled out. State control of media and censorship makes that possible. Participation in the plan is almost increasingly compulsory, especially for party members. And if you start organising a group to oppose the plan, well, you might find yourself in an interrogation room. But there is still an overarching commitment to reflecting on the past, making a plan for the present, with the goal of producing a better future. And because China and PRC doesn't have elections, the same party has the problem that it has to own all the mistakes and the horrors of the past. You know, in other places, such a party would lose an election, split up, disband, reform, and give themselves a new name and, reshuffle and put the same old hacks back in and say, we're new, and then just wipe away the history of the past. But the CPC can't do that. And instead what it does is issue things like the historical resolutions. And the most recent of these was just a couple of weeks ago. And that's with the goal of explaining to people the twists and turns of party policy, the twists and turns that the parties had to make to deal with all the contradictions and the errors and to justify continued unchanging control on power. And moreover, it's important to keep in mind that Unlike many other dictatorships around the world, the CPC does actually pay close attention to what the masses are saying. Listening to the gripes and groans of the people is crucial, and investigations into the local situation has a long history in China, both in the imperial era, in the pre-1949 era, and in the PRC era. And without multi-party elections as a legitimising process, the CPC needs to be preemptive in learning about the discontents among ordinary people. Public opinion's carefully gauged. The party genuinely does want to know what people think, and they really want to get to the heart of those issues before they become sparks of another revolution. So, in contrast to some of the commonly held views, the Communist Party cannot and did not expand the wealth and prosperity of millions of its people in the last few decades by drawing on a well of sullen compliance elicited by command and obey systems. In fact, what they created was a system that has unleashed huge energy and innovation and brought wealth to many. Coercion does not produce mass prosperity. But an important negative example that I think proves my point that does still need our attention, and that's the re-education camps currently operating in Xinjiang. Now, these are definitely coercive rather than persuasive, and they have, in their intent and operation, people don't choose to enter them and they can't decide when to leave. And their explicit goal is to bring Uyghurs into the correct way of thinking to justify Beijing's government. And the special treatment meted out to the Uyghurs is justified in the heads of the party's planners as bringing development and improvement to people who need it. And the roads, the bridges, the factories, the apartments are stretching out along throughout Xinjiang, of which there are many. In the eyes of the CPC, these are good things. But like the colonial powers from Europe who developed Australia, the locals' cultures and values and choices about how they might want to develop are disregarded. So we get mosques being lost, religious and cultural sites ploughed over, local languages and cultures devalued. But this kind of coercion reflects a systems and policy weakness, because it couldn't occur in the more densely populated parts of China if you, as the Communist Party does have, a goal of prosperity for many people. So the racial and religious separateness of the Uyghurs and their geographic distance from the core of Han China limits the damage that this really terrible policy will have on the overall national plan of getting China stronger and even more prosperous. So I think it's a really grave policy mistake, and it'll be a really difficult one for the government to rectify, because a lot of the trust has been broken between the people of Xinjiang and the government in Beijing. Generations of Uyghurs who'd integrated with Han culture, they'd worked in the Chinese state apparatus. They were really enthusiastic supporters. They'd learned Mandarin, and then now they're treated as if they were separatist fighters. So a lot of that talent has been wasted, and the opportunities, of their potential to contribution has also been lost. And with the serious ethical challenges, it's just a really bad plan. Enforcing compliance is also expensive. So it's unlikely to generate new ideas that will drive innovation or inspire productivity in workplaces. So basically it's bad for economic and cultural growth. So the less brutal wings of the CPC know that it's much better if Chinese citizens want them to be in power. And you don't have the expense of all of the coercion. So once the coercion stops, I really think that you can see the energy and the culture of the Uyghur people really returning to benefit China and also the world again. So on to the second question, why do I see China this way? Why do I see China as a nation that's filled with people who care enough about it to critique it and reform it? Well, there's lots of evidence of this in the pre-49 and post-49 China. The photo of the 22-year-old Louise that advertised this talk was taken at the historic home of Lu Xun. Now, he's one of China's most preeminent authors and social critics, and he wasn't one to hold back on his criticism of his fellow Chinese. He was a sharp satirist and a caustic wit, and he published dozens and dozens of stories, essays, poems during the 1910s through to his death in 1936. In 1921 and 22, he published a serialised novel about a fictional man who, to him, represented several negative aspects of the Chinese national character. It was a ne'er-do-well called RQ. RQ had the self-comforting and self-deluding habit of failing to see the reality of his miserable state by imagining himself as being spiritually superior to those who were clearly more powerful than him. His money gets stolen, he gets beaten up, he loses employment, but he still tells himself that he's the main man. He goes for a drink, sleeps in, wanders around, skives off. He's winning in his own little head. He's spiritually and morally superior. He reframes every defeat as a victory, tapping that deep well of self-delusion. And like most men who are losers, RQ treats women as things, objects that are to be used and abused. After one incident when he was beaten up, he decides that he can go and pick on someone who's lower down the social ladder. So he pinches a young nun who's walking by, harasses her, humiliates her, frightens her, and all the people standing around just laugh at the incident. Nobody steps in to help because, as a nun, she's opted out of the marriage system and lost the right to male protection. As the nun runs away, she curses RQ and she says, "May you die without sons." And that, of course, is like tapping right into that core of, it's a core failing in patriarchal masculinity in Chinese terms. So he decides then, I'm going to get myself a wife. He's entitled, right, because he's a man. So he targets a widow who's a domestic servant of a neighbour. During a work break, he just rushes in and he says, "Sleep with me," expecting her to be grateful for his attentions. And the police are called, because she's obviously not grateful, and then he's punished. But even then, RQ's rationalisation is these women, they are the problem. And ironically, the conversation that he and this widow were having was about how their mistress was unhappy with the master because he was talking about taking a concubine. So Lu Xun was talking about these kind of gender issues through this character. Now, 21st century readers, of course, just see these incidents as just straight-up cases of sexual harassment. And the nun and Miss Wu would be, tweeting #MeToo or #RiceBunny, depending on whether your government was using the having inquiries and commissions into the pesky, uppity women's complaints or was using the nothing to see here, doesn't exist method of avoiding and delaying scrutiny of sexist patriarchal ideology and practice. The story of RQ then was one of just many of the stories at this time that were rethinking China's gender norms. Many others, writers, political thinkers, were dealing and addressing the question of women. And for much of the 20th century, women were the emblems of change. It was in their image, that of the modern woman, the image of the modern woman, that the reformers marketed their plans to the broader population. Sex could sell modernity, democracy, communism, militarism, just as well as it could sell cigarettes. So many men wrote and spoke powerfully about the importance of women's rights, sex equality, and women as self-actualising individuals. They supported their feminist sisters, friends and colleagues. They even, and this is really a shocking but true story, some of them even thought feminism was a good idea for their wives and not just their daughters. Amazing. So the status of women did improve dramatically in the 1920s, 30s and 40s and for millions of women, and it's continued to improve for decades to the present, just as it has in Australia. But one feature impacting women in China that was unique to China was the one-child family policy, stretched from 1978 through to 2015 when the two-child family policy came in. In May 2021, a three-child policy was announced, but unlike the other previous two, this had more of a target feeling than a limit to it because in recent years, not only were people not rushing to have two children, they weren't even rushing to have one. And it wasn't just in the PRC that this low fertility trend was happening. Other localities in Chinese populations that didn't have one-child family policies, like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, also saw similar declines. 1 and 2, and even none was good enough. So let's have a look at those fertility rates. Replacement naturally is about 2.1, and in 2020, Chinese-dominated localities were the first, third, fourth and fifth lowest fertility rates in the world in 2020. So Taiwan has 0.99 at number 1, South Korea comes in at number 2 with 1, Hong Kong is 1.1, Singapore 1.1, Macau 1.2, China's sitting at 1.3, Australia, as you probably saw in the news last night, it's actually got to 1.5 this year, it was 1.7 last year. So what's interesting about these things, apart from the fact that it seems like Chinese places don't want to have many babies, is that for China mainland, it's achieved this demographic profile of a developed country, even when it wasn't a developed country. And that was a result of the one-child family policy. But the continued low fertility rates in China, despite the easing of that policy, tell us that it's not just about compliance with the law that's helping people make these decisions. It's about choices partners are making now that they have access to contraception, and choices about how they live their lives. And, for a long time, I was told that Chinese people love families, they cherish children, they look after their elders, and how we Westerners were just selfish individualists. And one of the things that always puzzled me was that it didn't really match with what I saw on the ground. And it also didn't match with my own experience of my own family, my friends' families. And we seemed to quite like each other. We liked each other's kids and we looked after our parents and grandparents. But, there was this ideology. It was pretty much set in stone and probably still is. But the data, which can't lie, tells us that maybe Chinese people love the idea of the family, but the reality is actually just too much of a bother. And equally importantly, the historical research that I did showed a culture that loved sons and tolerated daughters. Sons carried the family name, honoured the ancestors and the descendants. But someone has to have the daughters, right? Otherwise, who will my son marry? Hopefully some other fella's family. And the son preference remains central to current PRC culture. After all, if we look at China today, men get most of the best things, the best jobs, the most power, more wages, less abuse, more autonomy. So having a son gives your family the best chance, right? And that's where the one-child family policy had an interesting impact. Many women liked it because it relieved them of the burdens to keep having to try for a son. For earlier generations, this meant years and years of being pregnant with no small toll on your physical health, let alone your employment and financial security. In the past, some wealthy families bought in concubines to increase son production potential, a commercial trade in women that was only stopped in 1931 in China proper and in 1971 in the British colony of Hong Kong. But the pressures to have sons was still sufficiently strong in the years of the one-child family policy. Families were prepared to pay fines, lose their government jobs, coveted party membership to strive for that son. Others got around the law by female infanticide, sex-selective abortions, neglect of female babies, not registering female babies. Now, all of these were ways that you could get another go at having a proper child. Demographic data from the decades doesn't lie. Almost all of China's provinces had sex ratios at birth that produced more boys than the natural ratio of 105 boys to 100 girls. While poorer rural provinces had some of the worst ratios, even some wealthy seaboard provinces like Fujian had 120 boys born to 100 girls in 1986. And in 2020, one-child family policy is not operating right, but at a national level, it is still 111 boys to 100 girls. Not a single third child was female for decades and decades. And this is a common trend around the world where sons are king, by the way. It's not just a China problem. By hook or by crook or by ultrasound scan, you don't endure a third pregnancy and labour just for a daughter. So on the one hand, females are ranked lower. But as the demographic truth markers show, women still have their options limited simply because they're women. No women are members of the upper echelons of the party. Few are in the government. Harassment, workplace discrimination, all still abounds. There are very weak institutional protections for women from predatory behaviour from powerful men. It's almost as that, it's like the current situation of the Australian Federal Parliament was spread across all sectors of society. But on the other hand, millions and millions of singleton daughters have been raised with quite a healthy sense of their self-worth, self-respect, and even independence. And now they're women of childbearing age who would in the past be marrying and producing the next generations. Well, they ain't on board anymore with the whole dutiful daughter-in-law, happy domestic wife gig in quite the same numbers as they were in the past because they have choices. The old double standards of chastity that kept women in their place, they're withering. In the past, women's virginity before marriage and purity after marriage was closely guarded. And in the Qing dynasty, you even had women were given, their families were given, awards for if they killed themselves after they were molested, assaulted or raped. While men, on the other hand, had no sexual virtues that needed protecting and could visit brothels where young women from poorer families were prostituted without any reputational risk. So these traditional Chinese values seem to be disappearing. Well, the ones for women, because the men still do go visiting brothels. Young women today and the young men that they hang out with no longer universally think that good women must be chaste. Premarital sex, premarital cohabitation, serial monogamy, acceptance of sexual diversity, these are all challenging the old patriarchal family models. Singletons don't need families. They have friends, sometimes friends with benefits. Marriage and mothering appears increasingly like a bad option for Chinese women. If they marry, they'll not only have their own parents to look after, but also their husband's parents. And who knows if he'll be bothered picking up that kind of woman's care work. So as you'll have, as a wife, you'd have your own kid and their examination hell to go through, or your other 2-3 kids, and you'd have 4 parents to look after. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like one hell of a squeeze. And many women privileged with education, employment, money, they no longer need to inflict that on themselves. And even if they hired a domestic servant to help out, they're potentially inheriting even more money from their 2 parents and 4 grandparents, so they don't need anything else. They don't need anything more. Now, rural women, poorer women, clearly have fewer options, and they probably can't go it alone. But even they are moving to urban areas to work in factories and delaying partnering as well. So the benefits of marriage for women are just not as great as they are for men. Chinese women of reproductive age are pulling out of the marriage market in larger and larger numbers. And this is why the government is supporting a narrative about leftover women. It's basically an attempt to shame women back into the marriage market. If you're in your 20s and 30s and unmarried, you're either to be pitied or derided. You're too selfish, too proud, too careerist, under the influence of foreign feminists. And all of these things are making you refuse to settle down and do the right thing for the great traditions of Chinese family values. Well, the government, in supporting this narrative, is actually responding directly to the anxieties that it's heard from many, many ordinary men and their mothers and fathers in their various public opinion surveys. Hey, I aborted, drowned, discarded 2 girl babies to have this son, and now he can't get a wife, let alone a son of his own. Not fair. So unreconstructed men and their parents with old-style views about families are struggling to find partners. Rather than wage a campaign to reform ideas about masculinity, marriage roles, or the pernicious influence of meddling grandparents, the pressure is on the women to change. Brokers now, and there's another trend that's really amusing, brokers now arrange brides and bring them in for Chinese men from neighbouring countries, poorer countries, and the same is happening in Singapore. Unreformed patriarchy is on the hunt for women that it can still boss around. It's a global trend, and it relies on economic inequality to fuel it. Not only are marriage rates plummeting in China, but the divorce rates are high, and women are the ones who are initiating most of the divorces. Demographic data doesn't lie. In order to slow divorces, the new law came in January 2021 that extended the cooling off period between the application and the approval process to 30 days. And, I think, oh my God, we're so oppressed by our laws in Australia having to wait a year. The new laws mean that either party can withdraw the divorce documents without the consent of the other party, and then you need to have the new application submitted by both parties again. So you can see the games that spiteful partners could play by withdrawing the application, not letting the other partner know. And it would be particularly hard if you're trying to exit a coercive, controlling relationship. But again, the sad thing is this is a change the government is making in response to the anxieties it hears from the ground up. It's responding to the popular anxieties. But it's not a good policy. If you want to promote marriage and fertility by making divorce more difficult, my guess is that this will have further negative impacts on marriage rate. Marriage will become an even riskier option for women who've got choices. Family stability is what the government's concerned about. Inability to get or keep a wife is what disgruntled men are concerned about. And unmarried, hanging around the place children are what a lot of parents are concerned about. But you know what? Hearing all this chatter, the singleton young professional just flicks back her hair, books her flight to Hainan Island and says, yeah, whatever, some other mug's problem. These social changes have emerged as a result of rising wealth in China, in parallel with largely unreformed misogyny and patriarchal thinking about what a family might be. If you want women to marry and have babies, make it a more attractive option for them. Start exercising that immense capacity for self-critique, re-evaluation, and renovate the patriarchal culture that's making marriage and child-rearing unpalatable for women with choices. So then, third point, what should our approach to China be? One immediate and urgent thing we need to do is walk back from the path of thinking that we are somehow responsible for saving China and saving the Chinese people from the CPC. It smacks too much of the 1850s mentality of European and American colonialists who rationalised their greed for China's riches in terms of rescuing China from their despots and from atheism. Well, the idea that we needed to save China was nonsense back in 1850, and it's nonsense in 2021. China does not need the West to reform it. Chinese people are quite capable, shocking as it may appear, of addressing their own issues. They are curiously well equipped to do so. Rumour has it that they speak and read Chinese pretty well and know a good bit about their past and their present. And they also spend hours and hours learning the latest ideas from around the world too. Apparently, they're really good at getting ideas from American companies and Australian universities. But keep in mind, they are, as we have seen with the Civil War, the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution, also more than capable of mucking up their own country. They don't need help from the West for that either. So let's not save China or save the huddled Chinese masses from their autocrats or save Chinese souls from the atheists. Not again. We did that a century or so ago, and it didn't work then. Chinese people just suffered more, and the more we help them. We need to leave our submarines and our foreign-influenced and foreign-built and foreign-designed hardware in Darwin, or maybe in a marginal seat in Adelaide. We need to stop being like RQ and thinking that we're somehow superior, despite increasing evidence to the contrary, because we fancy that our democracy is somehow intrinsically superior, even while we trash the very institutions that underpin it, like the best of the autocracies. Values like transparency and accountability that are trampled on a daily basis in Australia, yet we trot around the world like we're some sort of beacon of democratic virtue. What a disgrace. Our response to whistleblowers is often to sue them, jail them, bribe them into silence. We're allowed to lock up Muslims on Pacific Islands and turn back boats in breach of every refugee and human rights convention because, well, we're a democracy. Oh, we can blow up sacred sites in Western Australia and go, oops, sorry, too late. We've got an electoral circus every 3 years that gives us a hall pass to commit any kinds of abominations we want for our own marginal seat winning convenience. We're suffering from RQ's disease, self-delusion and a misplaced sense of moral superiority based on an outmoded sense of our own glory. Chinese people in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau don't want to be bombed to be saved. They know that war will wreck their wealth, their health, and it won't enhance their freedom of speech, their right to believe in whatever kooky supernatural snake, rock, virgin or God, because war produces chaos, instability, famine, disease, economic decline, and floods of refugees. Watch out, Pauline, you ain't seen the half of it. The current crop of identikit men in political power, and I'm talking about China here, not Australia, just in case you didn't know, might be a pretty unappealing bunch to many people. But there is a habit of self-critique and self-reflection in China and a genuine desire to build a strong and wealthy country. You don't achieve that by blankets of repression. They tried that, and they're still trying it in Xinjiang, but it was a colossal failure. So the other thing is, I think, and shock horror, our way of life, the Australian way of life, actually depends on their continued success, up and down as it is. Our ability to hold on to the Australian values we trumpet actually depends on the success of this current crop of men with their bathroom cupboards full of black hair dye. Nothing could damage Australian values, Australian way of life, more than military adventurism in East or Southeast Asia. And we need to start acting like grown-up democracy. We need to have a war powers reform because currently the laws allow our Prime Minister alone to take us to war without consulting even Parliament. We did that in Iraq, illegally according to UN rules, and what an unholy mess that was. Currently, one single Prime Minister can plunge us into war and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. So let's get serious about our democracy and have a bit more accountability. So how do we do that? How do we better engage with China as well? Well, in this series, we've heard some really great ideas from Jason Yatson Lee, Bill Birtle, Stan Grant and Linda Javan, so I don't want to repeat what they've said. I'll just add on. Now, a project that I'm working on at the moment that I'm involved in has been funded by the Foundation for Australia's China Relations and run through the Australian Academy of Humanities. And we're seeking to map Australia's China knowledge capabilities to find out what the education sector can do to deliver to end users in a variety of sectors: business, arts, health, expert knowledge about China. And a key problem is that the sections of the universities that generate China knowledge and transmit it to the next generation have been very hard hit by the funding cuts and university managerialism. Doing China in most universities today is conceived of as extracting money from Chinese foreign students while simultaneously closing China studies courses, since most of these are in the now derided humanities or social sciences disciplines. So what we're trying to do in this project is to a stocktake of where we are in our current capabilities for understanding China's rise, and we really welcome your participation in that process. There's a few members of the team here today if you'd like to speak to them. We need to develop a broad-based, informed approach to China and diversify our public debates beyond the security and military perspectives. We need to hear about how Australian businesses are operating in China and how they work with their Chinese counterparts, how educators and researchers collaborate, and how cultural organisations exchange talent. We can't just drift along thinking that China's the arena only of the foreign parts of our government or institutional structures. China's so big, so important in so many arenas that it can't be left just to defence or just to trade. It requires a much bigger vision than we've had to date, bigger even than the Australia as an Asian nation heyday of the 1990s, when Australian leaders wisely recognised the reality of our geographic proximity to Asia and the cultural and economic value that this proximity promised. China's so big, and yes, it is challenging in many ways, and it's so influential that we need to integrate it into every aspect of our planning policy and all of our public and private institutions, as well as our community organisations. And we need to be prepared to make changes in response to that integration. China's not just an add-on wing to business as usual. It's not an ensuite to the master bedroom. It's a total renovation, remake, remodel. And crucially, integrating China into every part of our policy and planning is going to change us. Get ready for it. Prep up. Don't be caught by surprise. Staying still is not an option, and looking backwards is definitely not a strategy for success. It's going to be an exciting ride, so strap in.